Let's just look at the situation of the United States, which is still the world's largest military superpower and still the world's largest economy. Everything is therefore fine? No, it's not fine. And it's not fine because that defense budget is inexorably going to be squeezed because of the massive amounts of borrowing that the federal government has engaged in since the financial crisis, then the pandemic, and more recently as a result of, I think, misguided fiscal policies. The debt to GDP ratio is now around about 110%, which it last was at the end of World War II. More shockingly, the deficit this year is running at around 7% of gross domestic product, and that's near full employment, an extraordinary figure. So US fiscal policy is out of kilter. And the problem with that is that as interest rates have risen, to combat the inflation that I think was one of the unintended consequences of Joe Biden's first year in office, the cost of servicing that debt has gone up enormously. And so debt service is eating up a much larger share of federal revenues than it was in the period of zero interest rates. Of course it is, because rates have shot up. And that's right, as you just said, probably this quarter, spending on servicing the federal debt will exceed spending on national security, on defense. I've said for many years, it's one of my old historical axioms, that any great power that's spending more on debt service than on defense is probably not going to be great for much longer. There's a huge need for fiscal reform in the United States. There's no sign that the political class gets that. In fact, neither party seems serious about fiscal reform, and that's been true for nearly 10 years now. So that's a really important reason to be concerned about the ability of the United States to project power over multiple theaters over the next 10 years. But it's worse than that, John, because fiscal numbers don't tell you the whole story. In the last 20 years, there has been a fundamental shift in the balance of industrial power. Back at the beginning of this century, in about 2002 or 3, US manufacturing value added was twice that of China. Those roles have been reversed. Today, China's manufacturing value added is roughly twice that of the United States. China is the workshop of the world. It is the arsenal of autocracy. And the US is no longer really the arsenal of democracy. And that means that if it comes to a conflict between the United States and China, it's the Chinese who can supply their armies far more readily with the weapons of war. With all that stuff that it turns out, look at what's happened in Ukraine, really matters. You need a lot of shells, 105 millimeter shells. And if you run out, you're in trouble. Well, the United States would run out of precision missiles within a week of a war with China. So that is another reason, perhaps a bigger reason to be concerned. And finally, you asked about China's strength. It is true that China's economic growth is slowing. It is true that the demographics are dire. The workforce is shrinking. The population could halve between now and the end of this century. And it's also true that the dynamics around the property sector, indebted property developers, are dragging the whole economy down. But I don't think that makes China less dangerous. I think, if anything, that elevates the risk of a strategic confrontation. Because the Red Emperor knows that the legitimacy of Chinese communist rule will be undermined if the growth rate slumps from 5 to 3 to near zero, as I fear it may in the coming decade. And that is what concerns me most, that a weak authoritarian regime historically is much more likely to lash out than one that feels confident. Hitler did not go to war in 1939 feeling confident. He went to war partly because rearmament was no longer sustainable under peacetime conditions. That was one of the rationales for gambling on war in 1939. The Japanese went to war, not because they felt confident, but because they felt that they were being crushed by economic sanctions. So I think the lesson of history is be most worried about the authoritarian regime when it is in the greatest economic difficulty, when you've successfully applied pressure to it. That may be when it lashes out.